I have already done this from beginning to end 5 times, and if I have to do it one more time, I don't think I can personally handle that. Anyhow, what's up? Over the last 2 lectures, we had an introductory account on She Stoops to Conquer. We get introduced to the main characters, and we witnessed the beginning of Tony's device. In today's lecture, we launch on Act 2 of She Stoops to Conquer. At the beginning of Act 2, we see Mr. Hardcastle having a hard time communicating with his servants. Apparently, he has been teaching them to conform to certain instructions and teachings when it comes to receiving guests at their house. So Mr. Hardcastle has been training his servants to act in a certain way when Marlow and Hastings are there. If you remember from the last lecture, Hastings and Marlow are in town so as to propose to Kate, Miss Hardcastle, Mr. Hardcastle's daughter. Now we get introduced to Mr. Hardcastle's servants, Diggory and Roger, and there is also a third servant. Now Mr. Hardcastle has been teaching them how to place themselves behind his chair, how to take their hands out of their pockets, how to not be talkative, how to stop drinking, or how not to desire to drink and eat when guests are around, how not to laugh at their jokes, also to be attentive. But apparently they do not conform to his instructions and teachings because they are dumb. They are dumb in a sense that they are in this play so as to induce so much laughter, because we see Mr. Hardcastle very outrageous, very serious. He is teaching them wholeheartedly, whereas they do not care, they do not retain any of his instructions. So such situations in comedies induce so much laughter. At the end, he calls them blockheads because literally they cannot recall any of his teachings. When we talk about Mr. Hardcastle, you need to keep in mind that he used to be a man of influence. So there must be family traditions and family rituals that he perseveres to keep in his family. Okay, so he does not allow his servants to misbehave and spoil all of that. Now, we have Marlow and Hastings come into Mr. Hardcastle's mansion. Mr. Hardcastle receives them. Now, the key for understanding this part of the lecture is to remember that last lecture I said that Marlow and Hastings have been deceived by Tony Lumpkin into believing that they are heading towards a luxurious inn, not Mr. Hardcastle's house. Now they believe they are in an inn, and they believe that Mr. Hardcastle, that they are apprehensive about meeting, is actually an innkeeper. We see here that Marlow has an inkling and tickling feeling that this is a mansion, not an inn, because he tells his friend Hastings that it is the fate of a mansion to be reduced to an inn. So such a remark really induces so much laughter. And it is a shrewd remark, or Marlowe is a shrewd person to remark such a thing, because it does not really completely seems like an inn, but there are traces of a mansion in it. Now we come to a very important part, which is the fact that Marlowe is not a confident man. And we have reasons behind that. From his dialogue with Hastings, we infer that he is actually not a confident young man. And this goes against our expectations of Marlowe. Why? Because Marlowe has a bachelor's degree, so he went to college, and he is a gentleman. His father, at least, is a gentleman, so he should have a vast experience with fine people, with high society. But he, on the contrary, we see a man that lacks in confidence. Now, why Marlowe is anxious and intimidated by life, we can't say that. But in particular, he's intimidated and petrified by fine women. He cannot communicate with fine women. He cannot communicate and have a normal conversation with a woman that is cultivated and cultured. He just cannot do that. Marlowe says that he doesn't really have a vast experience in life. He haven't been with no fine woman except for his mother. So that has left a huge impact on his personality as a man. He just cannot communicate with fine, cultivated women. He cannot be comfortable and fluent when women are around. He is especially not apprehended or petrified. He is specifically petrified by the sight of a reputed woman who is all dressed up in her fine clothes or in her fine clothing and jewelry. He is petrified by the sight of reputed, cultured, cultivated, elegant, glamorous women, if we may use all these adjectives to define a woman from high society, belongs to high society. However, he does not have a problem with bar girls. Like, he does not have a problem with common girls. We see this trait also in Tony Lumpkin. Tony Lumpkin does not really like to get married to his cousin Neville, and Neville is a woman from the gentry. He does not like to get married to her. He sets his mother's scheme to failure because he wants to get married to a common girl called Beth. So we see this trait in Marlowe and in Tony at the same time, except for the fact that Marlowe does not like to get married to a common girl, but he has no problem communicating with them on many different levels. He says in here that he tried many times to break the ice and ramble with women, but he cannot. Now, we see that Marlow is setting an example. He says that he would like to be like, or he wishes he were like an Eastern bridegroom who does not have to go through this customary way of proposing to a woman and waiting for her to say yes and then making decisions around that yes. Here our culture is set an example. So he says that he likes to be like an Eastern bridegroom who does not meet his bride prior to their wedding day. Now, from this we can infer that Marlow is actually apprehensive about meeting Kate. Now, we see that Hastings is on the contrary. Hastings does not have a problem to speak and communicate with fine women, and he actually doesn't really go through this dilemma of having to think about a woman to marry, because he has already found the one, and the one is Constance Neville. Constance Neville. Constance Neville is Mrs. Hardcastle's niece. She was an orphan child. She was brought up by Mrs. Hardcastle, and she is still in Mrs. Hardcastle's custody. Constance Neville and her fortune. And Marlow and Hastings here says that he has won her consent as well as her father's before he died. Now Marlow and Hastings start to make themselves comfortable around there. Now, I want you to just imagine the situation. If you are at someone's house, if you are a guest at someone's house, you wouldn't make yourself comfortable at all. Whereas if you are in an inn or in a hotel, you make yourself as comfortable as you wish, because eventually you are going to pay for all of that. That is actually what is happening right here. Hastings and Marlow are making themselves as comfortable as they wish, because they are deceived, because in their minds they are in an inn. But this is shocking for Mr. Hardcastle, because he has this expectation in his mind that Marlow is a gentleman, he is a cultured man, so he would behave in a certain way that is acceptable, that is expected of a gentleman. But now Mr. Hardcastle witnesses the opposite. Marlow does not behave like a guest. He behaves like a common man, if we may put it this way. And this was striking, shocking to Mr. Hardcastle. Now, they strike another conversation with Mr. Hardcastle that revolves around politics, because Mr. Hardcastle was involved in politics and elections, especially for the municipality of the town. So apparently he was a councilman in his town. And Mr. Hardcastle complains about that. He says that he quitted her job in politics because he is fed up with the mistakes of the government, and nothing is going the way he wants them to go. And they ask him whether he does anything besides that. He says that he still has his position in town, because a lot of the important political decisions are made in his parlor. So he is still a man of influence. Before I forget about that, Marlow and Hastings also like the philosophical tone of Mr. Hardcastle. Remember, in their minds, he is a innkeeper, so he is not expected to be philosophical in any way. But his philosophical tone makes them think that he might be more than an innkeeper that pretends to be a gentleman. There must be some gentry in him. We go now to the whole disputation over Saba and the bed sheets. As far as Saba goes, they ask for the menu. They ask for the menu. Imagine that. Why does it induce laughter to see Marlow and Hastings ask to see the menu for tonight's supper? Because if you are a guest, you wouldn't ask your host to show you what you are going to have for supper that night. Now they start to press on Mr. Hardcastle's nerves. He's started to feel uneasy and outrageous. This is a very clever answer that is given by Mr. Hardcastle. He says, no man was sure of his supper until he had eaten it. This is apparently one of his ancestors' sayings, his uncle's saying. Now, after that, they ask him to get their bedrooms ventilated, to get their beds aired, to get their sheets aired. The word air in here has a different meaning. It is used as a verb, which means to remove dampness from beds and sheets, and maybe curtains. Now we see that Mr. Hardcastle directs a comment to the auditorium, to the audience, saying that Marlow and Hastings are two impudent people. He didn't expect them to misbehave. Okay? Now we see that Marlow goes with Mr. Hardcastle. They are going to see, to make sure that the bedrooms are ventilated. Now we come to a very important part, which involves Neville and Hastings. Constance Neville, Mrs. Hardcastle's niece, is in love with Hastings, who is Marlow's friend. Apparently, they have met before, they know each other, but for us, we see them meet for the first time as readers and as audience. We haven't encountered them together. This is the first time we see them together. Now, this is really important because last time I talked about this, that we have a primary device which is initiated and schemed by Tony Lumpkin, and we are going to see the proliferation, the multiplication of this device. Now we see that. Why? Because when Neville comes in, Hastings asks her what she is doing in an inn. She tells him, no, I'm doing nothing, I am at Mr. Hardcastle's mansion. So she tells him that he has been obviously the victim of Tony's trick. Now, Marlowe decides to keep this revelation from his friend. Hastings decides to keep this revelation from his friend Marlowe. So we see that Neville and Hastings keep up Tony's deception. Now we see Hastings and Neville decide to elope. If you remember this word elope, elopement from the Merchant of Venice, when it is used in the Merchant of Venice, when Jessica and Lorenzo decide to elope. Now, why do Neville and Hastings need to elope and not go through the customary way of proposing and making decisions around that? There is a huge setback for their marriage. And I talked about this in the first lecture. When we talk about comedy, we talk about bars, impediments, obstacles, or any kind of setback that hinders the union of the two lovers. We see that here in Neville's and Hastings' relationship. Why? Because Mrs. Hardcastle, Neville's aunt, is the impediment. She has already framed up the marriage of Neville and Tony. Both Neville and Tony reject her scheme, her setup for them. She tries to trap them into a wedlock. Why? Because she wants Neville's fortune to stay in the family. Now, keep in mind that Tony rejects Neville. He does not want to have her for a wife. Why? Because he is in love with a common girl called Beth. Neville rejects Neville rejects to take Tony for a husband, and Tony rejects to take Neville for a wife. This scheme by Mrs. Hardcastle is really clever, and also schemes are one of the characteristics of comedies. Mrs. Hardcastle takes advantage in the fact that both Tony and Neville are not yet coming of age. So they are both in her custody. Neville is in her custody. Neville's fortune is in her custody. The same for Tony. Tony is not yet coming of age, and she can make setups, and she can also trap them into a wedlock. So you see here this whole matrimonial scheme of Mrs. Hardcastle, which is an impediment to the union of Neville and Hastings. Now, before I end this, I would like to say that Neville and Hastings' relationship forms the subplot in She Stoops to Conquer, and it is closely and shrewdly interwoven with the main plot, which involves Marlowe, Kate, and the people around them, Mr. Hardcastle and Mrs. Hardcastle and Tony also. But this is the subplot. If you have any questions, you can drop them on our Google Classroom.